Thank you, Professor Grafton, and thank you very much to the Black McDonald Center at Hartford for inviting me here today. I know you people had a long day. You've had food already. You might be ready for another meal. It's been such a long day for you, so I hope that I will not disrupt your environment in any way, but try to be as productive as I can. I'm particularly honored by a number of colleagues who I've not seen for a long time being here, and that Professor Mahmoud Ayub has made special time to be here today. So my brief was to say what are my reactions to the encyclical Laudato Si. As I said, it's a very impressive document. It's a very detailed document. It is aspirational in many dimensions, but also addresses the crisis that we are facing today. And it helps set the tone for the Catholic Church in its evangelical journey of faith in the world. But I think it's also a document, it's encyclical, that multiple faith traditions can engage as a product, as a productive point of conversation between us. Now, this encyclical covers so much ground, it's so detailed, that I won't be able to do justice if I try to summarize. There are many conceptual issues, some of them that were already articulated by Dr. Karim Ahmed earlier in the panel here, some of the kind of scientific issues. There are theological questions, spiritual domains of thought, from the scientific to the economic and the political. And it will require many more years for us to figure out what exactly this document means. I will limit my remarks of how Islamic theology would frame the question of, number one, integral human development, which is a very core concept of this encyclical. Secondly, the question of human dignity. And thirdly, the question of technology. And if I do have time, I want to say something a little bit more generative about looking back and how did we get here. So kind of four things. Now, this word integral, we might, sometimes it sounds such an inundating word. What does integral really mean? The Oxford English Dictionary tells us basically it's something whole, it is something comprehensive. And what integral human development means is a need for a comprehensive and complete human development, not partial, and to espouse an ecological practice that is complete and comprehensive in order to be part of a solution to remedy human development or the ecological crisis. So here is a definition of integral human development. Quote, the state of a society in which the irreducible dignity of the human person, and the cultural and spiritual as well as economic and material requirements of human flourishing are central to political and social life and upheld by the rule of law. That's what integral human development means. In other words, all aspects of human life must intersect in very comprehensive ways. And it, as you know, it is part of Catholic social teaching, which calls for the holistic development of the human person, covering all aspects of life, social, economic, political, cultural, personal, and spiritual. And St. Francis of Assisi is the exemplar, as the encyclical says, of care for the vulnerable and of an integral ecology lived out joyfully and authentically. I would have rather preferred to use the word comprehensive or complete or holistic, but integral is the word they use. So in many ways, Laudato Si reminds us of the big picture that we need to get if we want to really get through in the 21st century. Taking the lift from my hotel to drop me off here, I suddenly realized that the things that the encyclical is talking about is part of our everyday. And I also want to remind you, as the Professor Grafton said, I'm born and raised in Cape Town. I've just been in Cape Town and I went through the water shortage there. Now, I don't know if you have water shortage here in Connecticut or in Hartford. But what, driving in the lift, the service, the woman who was driving me had a picture of somebody on her, hanging on her rear view mirror. And I had to guide her through because her Verizon Wi-Fi let her down, so I had to give her the guidance. So I was like talking to her all the time, and I asked her, after a couple of minutes now, we were driving through the city, I asked her, who is this TJ that picture you have there? Who is that person? She said, that's my son. I said, what happened to him? Why are you having his picture there? She said he was killed 2 weeks ago. Now, something that Cape Town, that many parts of the United States, especially African American communities, the crisis of crime and the crisis of poverty is what Cape Town and many parts of the United States have in common. Cape Town is the crime capital of the world. The most extraordinary beauty in the world, but the most crime infested. On Saturday, my cousin almost lost his life when he was hijacked by a group of people who knew that he was doing some deliveries. He has a business. They pinned him down. They took his car, took his cash, did everything and so on. The great thing is that he was alive. That, you give thanks to that. I have another cousin who's been paralyzed by crime. A man who just completed his doctorate and bought himself a car, and he was killed within injured badly within months. This is the ecological crisis. The economic is the ecological. The political is the ecological. This ecology, if we're only going to think about greenhouse gases, we're missing the picture. And that is the message of the encyclical. The encyclical is all about that climate justice is about political justice, is about justice generally. And so this whole question of the issues of our everyday, the issues that we need in terms of safety, security, protection. Yes, Hartford might not have a water problem, but Flint, Michigan still has a water problem. And so these issues are all interlinked, and they're also global. Many of you can tell me about problems of water in other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asia, in other parts of Latin America, in different parts of the world. Someone mentioned Puerto Rico, which is part of the United States, and yet it's being treated like a third world country. So integral human development is what is the core message of Laudato Si. And it is about, it's a wake-up call that if we are going to, it's not only about environmental waste, but it's also about the waste of human life. The waste of human life through our conduct and through our behavior. That I just now saw a family member narrowly escaping a life wasted. My Lyft driver who lost her son 2 weeks ago, and tens of hundreds and thousands of people around the world losing their lives in civil wars, in bombs being rained down on them from remote places in different parts of the world, is part of an integral human crisis. And so integral human development is the solution that Pope Francis has presented as a way that from his tradition he's addressing it. I want to say, from an Islamic tradition, there's nothing wrong in joining him in what in Islam is the commandment to join with that which is good. The key teaching in Islam is Amr bil Ma'ruf, the commandment to do good, the common good, to create the good, and also holding the hands of those and stopping them from committing evil. And that's the foundation stone of Islamic teachings. The Quran teaches one to sustain others from the wholesome and good things you have earned. You have to sustain others. Quran 2:267, to sustain others from the wholesome and good things you have earned. There is an acknowledgement in Islam of the irrefutable claim of the poor to the riches enjoyed by the wealth. Hence, the aspect of social welfare of the group takes precedence over the exclusive liberty of the individual, and then trying to strive for a balance between the communal and the individual. The economies of the world have undergone dramatic transformation since the days of the Quran was revealed, or when the Bible was revealed. And Muslim societies too have come under the spell of modern capitalism. The encyclical is directly silent about capitalism, but it is critical of consumption enabled by capitalism, and identifies consumption as a source for the destruction of the world and the environment. Of course, we could have benefited from a more closer understanding of the views of Pope Francis on the question of capitalism and how one should navigate the global economic system following the defeat of communism and socialist forces around the world. But I have empathy for the Holy Father, for his reluctance in trying to dwell into that, because I myself don't have a good idea of what is the economic model that we really should have. We those of us in the West, or those of us even in the rest, and the West and the rest, we are all gung-ho on a certain kind of liberal capitalism. And we have drunk the Kool-Aid to believe that that is the success story. And we have now, for the last 200 years of Western global history and globalization, if not 300 years or more, have now made this the model that everybody in the world has to strive for that model. But we also know, due to our crisis, that it is no longer a sustainable thing. Economists have told us that if everybody in China is going to have refrigerators like every US household has, and it emits the same kinds of bad kind of emissions that it does here, unless we find a breakthrough technology, then we're going to have environmental disaster. So I think lifestyle is going to be the big issue in terms of the way we're trying to understand what economic model we should follow. I'm writing a book on Muslim ethics, and I am petrified by the fact that I don't know what to say about economic ethics. I mean, I can make some platitudinous statements. I can issue platitudes about justice and fairness and so on, but that's all we have. Because the moment I step out and pay my Lyft driver or everything else I do, I'm joining another system. So I can only do my platitudes in my head, or in these lectures or speeches, or when I preach in a mosque. But what is the operational logic of that? That is really the big challenge that I am facing in terms of how to think about those issues. The encyclical talks about small-scale subsistence farming, but I also know from my other reading, from people who prepare us to understand how many mouths in the world should be fed, we know that subsistence farming is not going to meet the requirements of food shortages. So there's a lot of conversation that ought to take place with experts in various aspects to get to the finer points of this encyclical. The Islamic Declaration on Global Climate Change of August 2015 urges nations, among other things, that was the Islamic Relief statement that they issued after a meeting in Istanbul. Among other things, they say that we need to refocus, or the nations of the world need to refocus their concerns from unethical profit from the environment to preserving it and elevating the condition of the world's poor, end of quote. And it urges us, quote, to invest in the creation of a green economy. These, in my view, are admirable, pious statements, but you will require more than theology to model economic systems that will sustain such objectives. I'm no expert in that. I'm only one of those people that can issue platitudes. Laudato Si laments consumption and condemns the degradation of the world. Its most concrete recommendation is to suggest cooperative farming. But I already told you what I learned from economists, that there might be, certain things that might not fulfill. Human development, what I know from history as a historian and someone who studies religious ethics, virtue ethics, that human development or integral human development will require an economy of restraint, as the encyclical reminds us in several places. Caring for the poor and distribution of resources rather than optimizing profits should be the motive and outcome. Here the encyclical reminds me of the early Islamic writings that recommend humanity to labor and earn a subsistence, but the major virtue that is cultivated is restraint. How do we restrain ourselves? To meet the ends of both the encyclical and early Muslim aspirations would require an entire remodeling of human sentiments and emotions in order to divest us from the profit and competition motives. Welfare and cooperative models of economic coexistence do sound attractive, but will require the re-education of our psychological and moral sentiments. We have to undergo a whole process of re-education, and our moral sentiments have to be re-educated, because everything we are taught at schools through the media means that we are basically going out to how to cultivate our desires in a particular way. And the cultivation of our desires is managed. So what Karim said earlier about communication, that also means that the way we are mediatized, the way adverts and these things come at us, the way communication takes, that all will have to fundamentally change. Some fundamental changes have to take place there so that we don't have the waste economy that we have right now. Jeffrey D. Sachs of the Earth Institute at Columbia University summarizes the issue. He says, the climate crisis we now face is a reflection of a broader crisis, a global confusion of means and ends. We continue to use fossil fuels because we can, that's a means, not because they are good for us, ends. He says that Pope Francis and the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew urge thinkers and experts to think deeply about what is truly good for humanity and how to attain it. As of yet, experts are not clear how to make the economic transition from fossil fuels to safe renewable energy, even if the technology of how to accomplish it is increasingly coming into view. That's the last sentence is mine. As of yet, I believe, the experts are not clear about how to make the economic transition from fossil fuels to safe renewable energy, even if the technology of how to accomplish it is coming into view. Global politics today is in disarray. Weaker nations are at the mercy of larger powers, and there are angry people around the world. Anger and despair runs deep, and in many parts of the world, and especially in the Middle East, where the United States' role from 2013 has created a catastrophe from one country to the other, and all kinds of negative forces have been unleashed. And therefore, you see that in paragraph 6 of Laudato Si, there's been mention about global politics and the way in which humanity has been treated in different parts of the world, and civil wars and destabilization. My second point on human dignity. One concept that continues to have life in the modern world is human dignity that Muslims call al-karama al-insaniya, which appears in both secular and religious literatures of the modern age. Generosity, in my view, is embedded in the semantic framework of the Arabic word which is used for dignity, karama, with its KRM roots, generosity and open-heartedness. And that so much resonates with what the encyclical also talks about, and someone cited it from, I think, paragraph 91, Karim cited it, about the orientation of the heart and how open-hearted we should be. Not only does the word karama link dignity to generosity, but it also points to relationships of fullness between self and other. Dignity entails mutual respect, honoring and treating the other as one would treat oneself. A very basic teaching that all of us have in common and inherited it. But we know these teachings well, but we cannot always translate it into action. Dignity has a theological resonance given the centrality of divine compassion, mercy, and generosity in Muslim theology. The fulcrum of human dignity stems from the fact that humans are the carriers of the divine breath, or the spirit, the ruh, and that they enjoy the gift of knowledge. And dignity is universal, since knowledge and the divine breath reside in each human being. Beyond the primordially conferred dignity, human beings reinforce their self-worth in fulfilling their covenant with God by striving with good deeds for earthly betterment as God's stewards in earth. And as the Quran says, now indeed we have conferred dignity on the children of Adam, and we carried them on the land and sea and provided for them of the good things, and we preferred them over much of what we have created with definite preference, tafdeela. Now, we need to pause right here now. This verse has very interesting dimensions, but also aspects that we have to, in the light of the environmental disaster, we have to rethink that in very interesting ways. I was always puzzled by the idea that in the way that the Quran talks about conferring dignity, it also says that it takes humans over land and sea. I can see people going over land, but over sea, that means traveling, okay? So you have to. And what it has in common is about human habitation. It's about where we live. And where we live is, earth is our home. Whether it's on the sea or on land, we live there, resonating the message of the encyclical, but also the dignity is not that if we live with dignity, then it's assuming that we treat our home with dignity. That we treat our home with the worth that it deserves. And because we treated the world and the earth with indignity, therefore it is speaking back to us with such a vengeance, and saying things to us that we don't even understand, and the predictions that we could once make, we can't make anymore. The second part of it, it's about this idea that in Islam, that human beings are God's stewards, the Khalifa of God on earth. And this verse reinforces that and says that we have made, provided human beings of the good things, and we prefer them, these dignified creatures, over other things that we have created, a certain preference. This preferential option of not the poor, but the preferential option of the dignified, this preferential option of the dignified should be done with a certain amount of responsibility. Because this preferential option of the dignified means that you do not abuse those over whom you have to care. So this idea that we could just exploit the earth and do things to the earth no longer works. Or Muslims would always used to say, وَسَخَّرْنَا لَكُمْ مَا فِي الْأَرْضِ جَمِيعًا, that everything has been placed at the disposal of humans. Doesn't mean that it has to be wasted or used without good reason. And we need to rethink whether we're just going to use it for use sake. But is there a purpose to the use? So this question of our responsibility. The other part that always goes with this idea of responsibility is the pre-eternal covenant, according to Islamic teaching, that Muslims have taken with God, that in pre-eternity God had taken a vow from each one of us, that am I not Lord? And we all said yes. So that pre-eternal covenant and stewardship works together. And stewardship means that every time we reenact our stewardship, we are renewing our pre-eternal covenant. The renewal of the covenant goes continuously. One of the ways in which Muslim theologians talk about this question of dignity is the gift of reason is why human beings enjoy preferred status in the eyes of God, as the medieval Quran exegete Qurtubi explains. And reason as an instinct, a ghariza, gave humans a preferred status over other species of creation. Indeed, intellect or reason is the prerequisite in Islam. Firstly, it is through the intellect that humans acquire knowledge of God. And secondly, without reason, one cannot be a moral agent. You're not qualified to be a moral agent. To discern divine speech vouchsafed to humanity via prophets, to affirm God's messengers wherever they are, and to exercise moral responsibility, each one of these tasks requires the use of reason. The normative dispensation that Muslims call the Sharia, it's a normative practices, authorizes the use of reason and makes the preservation and promotion of reason to be among the 5 major purposes of the law. Now, one of the things that we today find is the disenfranchisement of the intellect and the disenfranchisement of sound thinking, of the attack on information, the attack on knowledge, and the kind of free run that conspiracy theories have, not only in the United States but around the world. We no longer believe in knowledge. It's about who can spin the best conspiracy story. And that's a complete violation of the gift of reason. And whoever can give us, a runaway accounts of untested ideas that cannot even be tested for falsification, we make them into instant, overnight, mediatized heroes. These are the issues, I think, that the encyclical addresses and that Islamic teaching reinforces in many ways in terms of the whole question of human dignity and the close connection of human dignity with the use of reason. Jarullah Zamakhshari, the Quran commentator, said, is in the 12th century, he said that God honored humans with reason, speech, power of discrimination, writing, and a beautiful form, median height, the ability to manage their affairs in terms of worldly subsistence and to attain the afterlife. And Zamakhshari adds, or it is said that humans are honored due to the ability to have control of what is on earth and because God put it at their disposal. Control means responsibility. Control does not mean abuse. So responsible stewardship is the watchword. Muslim moral philosophers, those who work at the intersection of theology and moral philosophy, are accustomed to tying legal or moral values to theological doctrines. The purpose is obvious: to provide legal and moral values with theological grounding. And here is the crucial difference to grasp in Islamic understandings of the human person. Islamic thought expresses the theological assumptions in the language of morality and ethics with a minimalist theological anthropology, but a greater emphasis on moral anthropology. How are you going to conduct yourself in the world? The linkage is the covenant with God. So every time you do a moral act, you are ringing ringing the bell of your covenant. Every contract that you fulfill, Muslim theologians explain, is a fulfillment of that pre-eternal covenant. So this is one of the issues that the encyclical emphasizes over and over. And I'm at the Catholic University, therefore David Grafton asked me to come speak here for people who have another faith teaching at Catholic universities, and the project that we do there is about the human person is quite significant in Catholic teaching. Now, this question of the human person, I want to pause here a little bit. In that the term human person is also used in secular terms. Now, my hesitation about the human person, the way we have used it, is that it's almost come to a kind of a deification of the human being. And I'm increasingly thinking that we are continuous with animals and vegetation. There's that continuity that we must give emphasis to. And I think that this question of the human person and linking it to human dignity, we must also know, and we have to be aware of history, that we now have what we would say to be a good understanding of human dignity in terms of our experience But we should know that human dignity was used in an age of slavery. Human dignity was used in an age of empire. Human dignity was used in a world where people were treating and continue to treat women as second-class citizens. And gender discrimination. All those good people that talk in discriminating ways about slaves, of race, also believed in human dignity. And so I think that we need to be aware and have that awareness and that humility to know that human dignity or personhood are both categories of work in progress. And so I think these are the core issues that we need to address. And furthermore, personhood and human dignity are also beyond the question of personhood and inalienable human dignity, are also the core issues in section 4 of Laudato Si, when it talks about the breakdown of the quality of human life. Now, one of the ways I think that I begin to think about human dignity, and especially from an Islamic perspective, while we are gifted with inalienable elements of human dignity, dignity means to become. It's about becoming. It's not a one-time deposited thing and then it's on autopilot. Dignity is also, we have to do the work of dignity and the work on ourselves and on our environment. So it's something that, so while we do have through our religious traditions that the gods that we believe, and that's not only the monotheistic, the Abrahamic traditions, or the Judeo-Christian and Islamic traditions, but other traditions also have notions or equivalents of what we call dignity, but it's not something that you just gifted and therefore you can act in a particular way, or that it is the monopoly of one religious tradition over the others. And I know that, modern human rights built itself on human dignity and so on, but it also comes from a very particular kind and particular definition, largely Western Christian understanding of human dignity that does not take into account other conceptual ways of human dignity, understanding human dignity, where human dignity requires continuous work and is not something that stops. And there are different ways of doing this. And so one of the questions of the word dignity itself, the word itself means worthy of merit. So dignity is not something that is a kind of a finite thing, but it's about worthiness and making oneself worthy. So dignity is not an entitlement, but dignity is a responsibility. And Laudato Si talks of self-knowledge, self-possession, and also freely entering into communion with others. And that's how we can do it through interhuman conduct and dignity. A very important 11th century Muslim jurist by the name of Sarakhsi, for instance, and I'm just going to quote him, he says, when God, the Sublime, created a human being in order to become the executor of God's trust of stewardship on earth, and God also honored or dignified akrama, this human being, with reason, aql, and obligation or duty, dhimma. So in Islamic tradition, being gifted with dignity is not it's a step behind that is also obligation and duty. Now oftentimes through liberal discourses, this duty component gets forgotten, but duty is quite critical to an Islamic conception of these things. And so and Sarakhsi continues, and so with the use of these capacities, a human being could attain an ability to perform the mandatory claims, hukuk, that God the Sublime placed on a human being. Then the Divine granted humans entitlements to sanctity or bodily integrity, hurma, and the freedom to choose. He used the word hurriya, but hurriya there doesn't mean liberal freedoms. Hurriya there means the freedom to choose and to attain ownership in order to secure their existence by enabling them to perform the tasks of divine stewardship that were vouchsafed to them. And then he repeats the line, he says, furthermore, they were entitled to freedom to make choices not subject to fate, to attain sanctity or bodily integrity and ownership from the moment they were born, inclusive of the person who has discretion as well as the one who does not possess discretion. In other words, people who might not have discretion because of certain kind of disabilities. And so Sarakhsi and Islamic thought is filled with these questions of the pledges and responsibilities that we need to have. And the scholar I spent a lot of time working on, Al-Ghazali, for instance, talks about the whole question of interiority and how central interiority is in our conduct, in the way we conduct ourselves, in our behaviors. Our behaviors begin from the inside, from our souls. And what I think this moment requires from us is more soul talk, that we talk from how we really feel about things, and not in terms of formality, but from a point of feeling. And that question that Ghazali also very interestingly says in his book called on the Marvels of the Heart, he says, he quotes there that interiority and about the heart, God dwells in the heart. God dwells in the heart of the believers, or God dwells in the heart of people. And so we need to do more heart talk, more soul talk, because the heart is the place of the soul. The point is to discern the theological and moral maps that have the potential to be advanced under new political conditions where dignity, rights, and personhoods are a priority. Now the challenge is to build and rework the elements of claims and duties within a paradigm where new political economies, albeit capitalist, socialist, or any other alternatives, prevail, and to do so in order to furnish a contemporary jurisprudence of dignity and to foster an ethics of dignity. And the Prophet Muhammad issued clear teachings that the human being carried qualities of sanctity derived from a relationship with God. It is this human divine relationship, I believe, that requires one to actively pursue the preservation of human dignity and one's self-worth as an end. I'm not alone in my pursuit of a jurisprudence of dignity. There are several other people that are doing that. I mentioned two. One is a man by the name of Muhammad Abdullah Daraz, who died in 1958, an Egyptian scholar, who wrote eloquently about that. And he said, human dignity, before anything else, he wrote, is a bulwark of inviolability and sanctity, protection and fortification. It protects the individual from the degrading behavior of others and prevents people from the forfeiture of any of their entitlements, or averts anything sacrosanct from being violated. And dignity, in Daraz's view, is derived from human nature, but is equally reinforced by religious discourses. And Daraz is among the few traditional Muslim theologians who unequivocally denounce slavery as antithetical to human dignity. And Daraz views all of Islam's moral teachings to be built on an edifice of human dignity. Apart from Daraz was also Alal Al-Fasi, who died in 1974, who also talked about dignity as the right of every person, righteous or sinful, and views that as a preeminent divine gift. And one of the things that he made prominent from Morocco, he was also a politician, a religious scholar, he's constructed elaborate vocabulary in which he viewed the struggle for freedom, sanctity of life, equality, justice, education and human development, food, drink and housing. This, I'm quoting Al-Fasi, who died in 1974. And as acts and works in pursuit of the sanctified struggle for human dignity, the jihad of dignity, jihad al-karama. That's what he called it, the jihad of dignity. And so jihad al-karama and all these things that Al-Fasi noted in his statement all resonate with what Pope Francis had said. Let me now turn to the question of technology, and possibly I will end here. And that is that the encyclical, in my view, is caught on the horns of a dilemma with regard to technology. It points out both the harms of technology, but in the end also views technology as an ally to help us out of the challenges we face. Indeed, technology, as many people have already pointed out, technology is Janus-faced. But I think the critique, in my view, is a little bit of technology in the first part of the encyclical is somewhat off-putting at times, because I don't think that one should take that pessimistic view of technology. So I think what the encyclical is concerned about is about the dual use of technology. The dual use. Of course, we can have steel for guns and steel for human protection, and we have made nuclear bombs and so on. But what it also warns about is a technocratic epistemological paradigm, a technocratic knowledge paradigm. And technology absorbs everything in its ironclad logic. Okay, yes, we have to face new technology, also reveals human nature in new possibilities, especially the kind of research I've been doing in kind of human genome ethics of that. There are enormous possibilities there too. So I think that the whole question of, but this is also the problem of not only of the Catholic Church, but religious people generally, that when on the question of science and the religion, the religious communities are quick to say no first, and then 20 years later they are the champions of it. That very technology, they said, oh, it's divine providence has now provided to us, and that is because of a lack of religious literacy in our theological education. And I think that's something that we have to remedy. Shah Waliullah, for instance, in 1762, an Indian thinker, for instance, talks very openly in his writing on theology of how human beings need to civilize themselves, and the civilizing, by means of civilizing, in other words, making the habitat and the conditions under which they live to make it better for themselves, so that we do not labor like quadrupeds, but we make it easy for ourselves in many ways. And he talks about that is part of a human requirement. He calls that the irtifaqat, that is to produce that which is beneficial in order to improve ourselves, self-improvement. Similar to what Norbert Elias talked about, what he meant by civilization is about self-improvement. And so I think this question of the question of technology is going to be the most challenging one. My way out of that technological question is that technology, which is embedded in our everyday lives, is part of our ontological makeup. It's part of our being. And we might have to think about technology in a different mode. Hence, the modes of thinking adopted by a scientist and theologian by the name of Egbert Schierman from the Netherlands, I believe, or Neil Postman, for instance, they talk about technology that leads us to dichotomous thinking and is possibly also alarmist. This mode of thinking, dichotomous thinking, privileges nature as normal and culture as additional, and culture as often unnatural and fallen. This mode of thinking privileges nature as normal and culture as additional, as I said. And I think that we should not fall for that notion of thinking, because for that matter, then Shah Waliullah, this 18th century Indian thinker who talked about civilization and using improvement, one would think that is unnatural part and dispensable thinking. But he does not disown technologies of improvement. The help that I get is from William E. Connolly, who helps make the point that technique is part of culture, and that thinking is neurocultural. That we're always thinking and Connolly avoids representational modes of thinking, that he is good at knowing, explaining, evaluating, and judging. The encyclical, in my view, is loaded with the sum of these kind of dichotomous modes of thinking. But I think if the alternative mode of thinking is utilized, where technique is part of culture and thinking is neurocultural, Connolly points out thinking itself participates in composing our thoughts. Thinking itself shapes and modifies our thinking as well as our thoughts. We are daily engaged in compositional thinking and in inventive modes of thinking. Thinking itself can sometimes modify the micro-composition of the body or brain processes as a new pattern of thinking becomes infused into body-brain processes. In other words, information technologies as well as other forms of dependencies we have on technology enters our body and mind streams. Neurons that fire together, wire together, Connolly approvingly cites two leading neuroscientists. In other words, we are not altering culture as such with technology. Rather, our bodies and our brains adapt together with our environment. And this approach to technology makes it look less ominous. And so I would end here by saying that the encyclical is hopeful in many ways, also about the things that it says about technology in the end, in paragraph 112. But I think here it requires more conversation between science and theology. It must be an integral conversation, a comprehensive conversation. Often the conversation is one of resistance. And finally, I would say that empire and imperial thinking, which we are gradually moving into that direction at the United States, imperial thinking in the past and imperial thinking in the present inhibits eco-moral diversity and changes the moral ecology of the world. And therefore we need a politics and technology that are driven by economies of diversity and moral economies of great diversity. Otherwise, we are going to end up in the place we are right now, that we, as the West, with our great learning and our great utopias, have taken the entire globe onto the precipice of destruction. Thank you very much.
I do think I want to allow some time for questions here. Just one particular comment that I have, very quickly. Jihad al-Karama certainly will be something that we can all get in mind.
That's right.
So I think it's a wonderful comment. So let me get a microphone, please.
And the jihad of climate change.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this insightful talk. A couple of words stuck with me, so I'm just going to say one of them, motivation. I think you passed over that. So the question is, well, it's well known that many in the Catholic community have either ignored or even disowned Laudato Si. Well, not too many, thankfully. The same could be said about the Islamic ethical dictates that you related. Ignored or basically be ignorant about those in the Muslim community. So what would it take to motivate people to take these things seriously? Because obviously traditional theological tricks are no longer working, even for those who believe themselves to be inside the realm of Islam or Roman Catholicism in this case. So that's the question. And the comment is, it's interesting that here you are as a Muslim scholar offering an appreciation of Laudato Si, an excellent, excellent thing to do. But the interesting thing here is that there is an interreligious component within the Laudato Si that I don't know if you're familiar with, but I was reading an article by a Jesuit scholar who found that there is a footnote in Laudato Si.
Of Ali Khawass.
Yes, right. So it's worth mentioning that even Pope Francis is in some way trying to not only speaking to diverse audiences, but actually using interreligious hermeneutics, you know, within this document, which is a very important document. It's not just his opinion, it becomes church teaching. So I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, no, I mean, I think I don't think I have good answers for your first question about motivation. You know, the work that I'm doing right now in where we're training young Muslim theologians in India and Pakistan online 3 hours a week, and then take them for 2 weeks in Nepal for summer and 1 week in winter training. We're doing precisely this kind of stuff, the question of human dignity. So we need to get into the minds and the hearts and the souls, at least the communities that I can work with, to get to them there at a very young age. There's a recently graduated, highly qualified in traditional thought, but never been exposed to this kind of interrogation and questioning of the tradition. These people then end up, and they are motivated in terms of their motivation is to be, there are multiple motivations, but they want to be on top of their theological game. They know the reason that I'm doing this project with the help of the Templeton Foundation is that the Islamic Fiqh Academy of India, the Islamic Fiqh Academy is like the equivalent of, not the authorities that say a Vatican would have, but it's an important center that gives authority to fatwas, to a segment of Indian Muslim. There are also Deobandis, also Barelvi and other Shia and Ahl Hadith groups and so on, varieties of Muslims and so on. But this is a very important one, high visibility. One of the Secretary General there kept on asking me for many years when I was at Duke, he said, you studied in the madrasas of India, you studied this traditional theology, it's time that you give something back to our younger generation. They don't know the stuff that you know, you've gone through it, you've experimented. And I said, I've made lots of errors. He said, well, exactly, you're making those errors, that's fine. We need to make the errors so that we can learn. We don't expect you to have the answers. So that's precisely what we are doing, is to get into at least some streams of Islamic thought, traditional Islamic thought, to start the conversation going there, and it's creating quite a few ripples in the circles in which those students are interacting. I think that, these students are going to become editors of journals, publications, people who speak to tens of thousands, if not millions of people through their fatwas or through their writings and so on and so forth. They're going to become people, agents of change, one hopes. Some of them, well, we're also hoping this message to go out. There are numbers of people who are the piety circles around the world, in the Muslim world. There are people who are pious, who want to be upright. They understand the language of the heart very well. All we need to do is to bring this dimension that the language of the heart also means responsibility is not about getting yourself into paradise, but is also about making sure that others also get there. And if others are going to be there in poverty, they're not going to make it to paradise. Or their lifestyle will not allow them. They will resort to a life of crime, their life of indignity that does not give them the best things in life that life has to offer. Or they will die in civil wars, or they will die in anger, they will die in all other kinds of impoverishment. To make them understand that's one thing. And yes, I didn't have enough time to talk about Ali al-Khawas, who was the Sheikh of Abdul Wahab al-Sha'rani. Now, we have to begin to think about people like Sha'rani and his Sheikh in 16th century Egypt. Sha'rani, I'm writing something about him these days. He thinks about Sharia in very interesting ways because he was a mystic and also a scholar of moral philosophy and jurisprudence that we call a faqih. And he brings those things together in very interesting ways and in recipes and in leaves out of our history that I think contemporary Muslims can learn.
Let's see one more question.
Thank you for your wonderful thought here. I find like it is really holistic idea. I'm taking your term, comprehensive, complete. My question is, and I found out actually this idea is similar with a book that I read by Moltmann, God for Secular Law and Secular Society. My question is, when we have our society a problem with, I call dualistic mind, that we already passed through our modernity and then postmodernity, then you now have your idea that you take from your religion duty and in ethical perspective, how you can use, how we can use our religiosity to not trap in the dualistic mind. For instance, you just mentioned when you do something and you make sure how to make our society, my friends, to be in paradise with me, meaning you have to do with many people, right? How to not trap in the dualistic mind. For instance, people now divided, some people address themselves or affiliated themselves to be religious, some of them concerned to be like just concerned with our work without taking any religious thought. How you can reconcile when you use your religious mind?
Okay, thank you.
I hope.
Let me see if I understand the question. So your question is about, people are kind of caught up in a kind of a dualistic thinking, secular and religious dualistic thinking, and how does one overcome that? And secondly, so what does this mean? Oftentimes when I get this question, people say that, are you not instrumentalizing religion, right? Isn't religion being instrumentalized? Well, first of all, this whole thing of dualistic thinking is that knowledge is knowledge. And I think for far too long, our religious communities, cocoon themselves in the specific alphabet of their theology and isolated that theological alphabet from the broader endeavor of knowledge and the enterprise of knowledge. Historically, that was not so. I think modernity, and despite many of its gifts, have created certain kind of silos. So we are siloed into that. And if I can talk about my own tradition, the theological champions of my tradition, Islam, I don't know, Christians and Jews are always better than us. So so maybe you guys are better. But the siloing of our learned tradition is so acute that one just cannot really go to Egypt or Syria or India or Pakistan or Indonesia or Malaysia. I travel to all these places. The siloing of religious authority would disconnect it from real knowledge. Meanwhile, communities who follow those leaders are on a different plane altogether. They follow them in terms of a certain kind of mediatized understanding what they want to take from them. So the demand for religion, it actually comes from the religious consumers. What kind of religion they want from this imam or from this sheikh of al-Azhar or from this mufti in Deoband or Barelvi, whatever the schools they are, they pick and choose. And so there's a certain kind of consumer discretion and choice. So the consumers and what we call pious people are people who are engaging in religious adherence and who are following religion. They making up the requirement of religion themselves is not so much religious authority. But oftentimes it often creates huge amounts of clashes. For instance, I just discovered that a very prominent South Asian authority who's very big in Islamic banking said recently in a fatwa that women in Pakistan should not be going to mosques for prayer. More and more women are going to mosques. They're opening up the space of Pakistan. A mosque now, women are going to that increasingly. They're coming under pressure. A very prominent authority who opens up all kinds of loopholes for Islamic banking closed up the door for women to go into the mosques. And I'm not even going to give you the reasoning because it's too embarrassing to say what he said so. So the point is that your question is, this dualistic thinking is part of a pathology, not part of how human beings naturally live. All the consumers of religion, whether Islam, Judaism, whatever, live life fully. They learn science, biology, they have their own views about cosmology, and they also have their own views of religion. They try to make sense of that. So the dualistic thinking, what we try to do, at least I'm trying to do, is to provide people with an integral understanding, a comprehensive understanding of what Islam as a cultural, civilizational force is like. So we have to think about less in theology and more in terms of civilizational terms. By civilizational terms, I mean in terms of making the full human being. Making a full human being with all the component parts for how we can sustain ourselves as people living on the earth. That is called civility and civilization. And knowledge is a crucial component that comes from our teachings, from our theology, as I just pointed out, of human dignity and so on, how critical knowledge is and learning in and reasoning is, and that one has to optimize that. Just the opposite is happening through dualistic thinking and through cocoon and silo thinking. And therefore one has to break down those barriers and open up people to the possibilities of learning in many, many more ways, and also to mix genres. So one of the things that I begin to find that 11th century, a thinker like Mawardi that I had in my paper, Mawardi writes a book called Adab ad-Dunya wa Deen, on the etiquette of how to exist in the world and in the questions of deen, which is salvation, or what we call today religion. He says that in this book, أجمع في هذا الكتاب بين تحقيق الفقهاء والترقيق الأدباء والشعراء والبلغاء. When I read that sentence, I was blown away. He says that in this book, I will combine the verities of the jurist with the subtleties of the poets, the literateurs, and the rhetoricians. In other words, and now more and more when I begin to look at that, I see Jahiz also doing that. Of course, Jahiz was a literary figure, but more and more people, I saw now, once you see something, if you have a hammer, as I said, everything becomes a nail. Okay? So now that I'm reading now, I found that Taftazani, in a very difficult text of his, has a small metaphor of how he thinks of Sharia as a kind of as an image, rather than just a set of things that you have to do. And so what I'm saying here is that 11th century Muslim thinkers already talked about these things in interdisciplinary ways. Therefore, I find the work of people like Sha'rani, Abdul Wahab Sha'rani, and his sheikh and his spiritual master, Ali Khawas, who was quoted in the encyclical, was very beautiful, thinks about the world in continuous ways that does not separate between the spiritual and the moral, but see that as a continuity. It doesn't see a separation between this world and the hereafter. It doesn't see a separation between matter and mind. So all this kind of dichotomous thinking that we have is something that we have to overcome and begin thinking of these things as a level playing field, and rather as fluid and intersecting and cross-fertilizing and cross-pollinating rather than separation. Thank you very much.